guys, welcome back to my channel. This is episode 2 of ADHD with Amy, my new series that goes through my personal experience with ADHD, getting diagnosed, sharing with you guys how to get diagnosed, my symptoms, what ADHD is, advice and tips, advice on ADHD in relationships and how they can look, tips on ADHD and friendships, and just all of the above. So let's dig into episode 2, how to get diagnosed with ADHD. So if you're questioning whether you have ADHD, I would definitely go and look at the symptoms. There's actually the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. DSM-5, 5th edition. So if you look on there, there's actually gonna be a list of symptoms for ADHD, and you can use that as a resource, but really, I'm just gonna go through, this video is gonna be going through how I was diagnosed, why I was diagnosed, and results after that. So let's get started. All right, so when I first had a feeling I had ADHD, I spent a few weeks really researching. I read a few books, I talked to some friends who were diagnosed, I used social media and YouTube as resources, which is why I'm creating this video, because I do want to share my personal experience with ADHD and kind of be like a big sister, because I wish someone was there for me when I was growing up and there for me when I was younger. So this is to anyone who thinks they might have ADHD, who doesn't know how to get diagnosed, who isn't sure what resources to look for. These are all of the steps that I took. First, I read a book, and there's a ton of books on ADHD. I hope this works. I hope I'm not blurry. Okay. The ADHD is kicking in. But where was I? There goes the ADHD again. Oh yes, why I got diagnosed and how. So once I started questioning, I was like, you know what, I want to figure it out, and it was getting so debilitating, as I mentioned in my last video, if you haven't seen it, episode 1, that it was getting really hard for me to do my job. And I think in the past, I was very comfortable with working with ADHD because I did jobs where I was constantly moving, constantly going from place to place. I was doing different demos, different expos, talking to people. And so I was constantly stimulated, right? And people with ADHD need the constant stimulation to keep themselves active and not bored, right? And so when it switched to me starting to work from home or being in a place where I was in the same position for a long time, I started to get antsy. I wasn't able to prioritize what tasks I needed to get done. I really wasn't able to get my job done in the most effective and efficient way, and it was really affecting my confidence in myself to follow through. So once I started struggling a lot, I decided that I would go see my therapist, and I spoke with my therapist, and at first she was a little hesitant to diagnose me. Well, she couldn't diagnose me, but she was a little hesitant to say that I had ADHD because I graduated from a prestigious college like UCLA, because I finished in a pre-med major. But I think I mentioned this in my last video, but people, especially girls with ADHD, get really good at masking and really good at hiding the fact that we're struggling with ADHD and hiding the fact that we struggle with forgetfulness, messiness, boredom from lack of stimulation. So that was the case in that situation. After speaking with her, I decided, you know what, let's go check out a psychiatrist, and that's what she also suggested. So I went to a local psychiatrist, and that first meeting with the psychiatrist was really to talk about all of the symptoms I was experiencing. They'll sit you down for about 45 minutes and they'll go through all of your mental health experiences, what you think you might have. They're really gonna give you a chance to speak and probably ask you questions. From there, they can have a better idea and potentially diagnose you with other things like anxiety, depression. ADHD is a little more specific, and it needs to be tested because ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is treated through medication. It's just the brain that works differently than everyone else, and normal or neuro. ADHD has a few more steps. So step 1 is going to a psychiatrist, meeting them for a first time, talking through your symptoms, and that's the first contact. After that, you're going to be scheduled in to go through testing, and the testing comes in 3 phases. And this is where I highly recommend having insurance, because it can get really expensive, even depending on what insurance you have. So I highly recommend advocating for yourself in terms of the cost to go through the 3 steps. The first one is going to be a meeting with the proctor or the tester, and they're going to go through a handful of questions to make sure that you're qualified to be tested for ADHD, that you meet the symptoms, that you're going going through experiences that support the fact that you might have ADHD. Number 2, you are going to physically go in person into a lab or a clinic to do the ADHD testing. And number 3 is going to be when you receive the results on a call with the proctor and go through your test results. After that, that's when you reschedule your appointment with the psychiatrist and they go through the following steps on what action steps are next to treat your ADHD if you have ADHD. And that can be a range of therapy, that can be learning, like taking new skills in, that can be medication. So there's a lot of different ways to work through ADHD, and I don't think it's a one trick fix type of situation. So it's important to know all of your options. So my first experience was not good because I didn't have a great insurance at the time. So I was really discouraged from getting tested, and I think a lot of people find this as an issue. It can be expensive. I called the psychiatrist and the proctor who was supposed to schedule my test, and they gave me a brief introduction. They said, hey Amy, this is what it takes to get the test. It's approximately 3 tests. The first one's $25, the second one is $800, and the third one is $65. And I was like, $800 to get tested for ADHD? I'd rather not know. I'd rather not know. And so for months I put it off. I was like, I don't even want to know. And my anxiety just kept building up because I was struggling with so many of the symptoms, like difficulty focusing, getting anxious and angry, difficulty having conversations without being distracted. Following that, I was lucky and fortunate enough to switch insurances. So this is why it's really important for you to decide what insurance you have and make sure it has good coverage. Because if you have an insurance that has terrible coverage, you won't be able to get a lot of the help that you need. And as someone with ADHD, health insurance has played a pivotal role. I'm not necessarily happy with how health insurance works right now, but it has played a pivotal role in me being able to get treated and diagnosed with ADHD. So once I got my new insurance, it ended up being completely free. And it can range from anywhere from like $65 to a couple $100, but if you have good insurance, then it will cover it. After my insurance was covered, then I booked my first appointment with the proctor, and that was a video or phone call. That lasted about 45 minutes, and she went through questions about, can you explain your experience to me? What are you experiencing? She doesn't go specifically into like what ADHD symptoms are you experiencing. It's more, tell me about your experience and I will decide whether you are suited to take the test. So after she goes through all of the questions, she will typically let you know whether it sounds like you qualify, whether it makes sense for you to get tested for ADHD, because the treatment is again typically medication, so they need to test you, right? They need to make sure you're qualified. They don't want people just getting medication. So after the first one, about 2 weeks later is when I went in person into the labs, and that's when I took my ADHD test. And I won't go through too much of the details in case you are getting tested. I went in, I sat at a desk, and I was on the computer for about an hour. My proctor beforehand warned me and said, hey, try not to fall asleep. Some people fall asleep during the test. And me being me, I was like, I'm not gonna fall asleep. Who's gonna fall asleep? Tell me who's gonna fall asleep. I've taken so many tests in my life in college, and not to brag, but like I have not fallen asleep during a test. So I was really confident going in. So I go into this little tiny white room, I'm taking a test, and I'm essentially clicking on a mouse when I see certain things. And I'm like this, and within 5 minutes, I felt my eyes getting heavy and heavier. And I was like, oh my God, I'm falling asleep. So I would like try to keep myself up, and I just kept going and going. And at one point I just felt my head nod, and I popped up and I was like, no way I fell asleep. So I was like, no, not again. I was like, no way. So I was super committed to passing this test. And it was super important to me that I tried my hardest because I didn't want to be misdiagnosed, right? I didn't want to be misdiagnosed with ADHD, and I wanted to know for certain that I gave it my all and it wasn't a mistake if I was diagnosed. So I went in, I took the test. After that test, they brought me to a second room where I took another test where I was also clicking on a mouse, responding to certain things on a screen, and I had a double mirror behind me. And I just remember going through it, and I was like, I'm not gonna fall asleep, I'm not gonna fall asleep, I'm not gonna fall asleep. And I just felt my eyes getting more and more tired, and I was like, I'm not falling asleep. So I would stand up and I would click from afar. I would click over here, I would stretch and click, I would do yoga and click, I would turn around to the double mirror not knowing whether someone was behind me, look at the reflection of the mirror and click as if I was playing a game just to keep myself awake. That's how difficult the test was for me. So I finished the test. It took about an hour and a half and I was out of there. And I asked the proctor, you know, like, when will I get my results? And they said in about a week or two. So a week or two after, I had a follow-up appointment scheduled with the test reviewer. I told her, I was like, I think I passed. I think I passed with flying colors because I think I hit every single point where I was supposed to click. It wasn't a hard test. I asked her for my results and she said, Amy, you have severe ADHD. And I just remember being so confused. I was like, what? Like, that's impossible, because although I nodded off for a second, I answered every question properly. And so it didn't make sense to me. Like, how could I possibly be diagnosed with ADHD when I feel like I did such a good job on the test? So she told me, and I was like, the 2 tests were so easy. I passed both of them. It was, I mean, I don't think I missed a thing. I don't think I was delayed. And she said, Amy, you took 5 tests. And I sat there and I was like, 5 tests. And she was like, yes, you took 5 tests. In my head, I'm like, no, I absolutely did not take 5 tests. But some of the tests were so boring, so fast, that I completely forgot that I took them. And that is just like a sign of the ADHD, that I was so bored that I don't remember. And so I asked her, I was like, is it common for people to be diagnosed with severe ADHD? And she said, no. And I asked her, did I fail the test because I fell asleep? And she said, no, because if you had fallen asleep through the entire test, it would have came back as invalid. But because you just scored poorly on the test, it came back as severe ADHD. And so I asked her, I was like, why did I not realize I was taking 5 tests? And so she told me that during the test, the proctor messaged her my results because the first 2 came out so severe and like surprising that they had them do 3 more tests on me and they all came back the same. With that being said, I don't think every test is the same, but this is she said this is the most standardized test for ADHD that I took. I took, again, multiple. And after that, after being diagnosed, I asked her what my next steps were, and she said that the next steps were to see my psychiatrist and talk about my options. Following that, when I went to see my psychiatrist, he basically told me that I had a few options. I could start with medication. I could start with just therapy, and he was super understanding in terms of the fact that I was scared. I was scared of the idea of medication, of having to treat ADHD, all of the above. But I was also desperate to fix the problem. I didn't want to live my entire life frustrated, and I did. I was living life very frustrated all the time, very anxious, very angry that I wasn't able to complete the task, constantly feeling like I had so much potential but I wasn't reaching the potential, constantly feeling like I was getting irritated because I couldn't pay attention to what people were saying. So I wanted to get it fixed. And so he said there were a few options. I could try stimulant medication, which is the most effective medication. I could try non-stimulant medication, which is a lower efficacy rate, which means it's like a 50%, it may or may not work. And then I could just do therapy. And so I had already been doing therapy for such a long time that I was open to trying new things. And I wanted to try the non-stimulant first because the idea of taking a stimulant ADHD medication scared me, to be honest. And the most commonly known stimulant ADHD medications are Adderall and Ritalin, and non-stimulant medications work for some people and may not work for others. So it's really a trial and error. There is no one size fits all. From there on, I just went into trial and error and experimentation, and I really just gave my full trust into my psychiatrist, into my therapist, and I was really open. And I think the most helpful thing in this diagnosis has been being open to the fact that I don't fully know myself at all times. I didn't know that I would have ADHD. I didn't know I've had ADHD for 27 years. And so I've been so open to learning, to trying things, to get a better understanding of why I function the way that I do. And it has been the greatest blessing in disguise this past year, because I can finally forgive myself for so many of the things that I blame myself for. I can finally allow myself to rest and slow down, because ADHD burnout is a real thing where people work so hard all the time to keep up with the mass, to keep up with how a normal person's schedule is, that they just burn out. So if that's you, I highly recommend looking into getting diagnosed, looking into what treatment options there are, and looking into more resources, because there are a lot of people out there with ADHD who don't talk about it, and it's more common than you think. I will go more into the treatment options, what I've tried, what I haven't, and my experiences with them. But until then, I will catch you guys in episode 3 of the ADHD series with Amy next time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ask any questions in the comments.